you want to follow with me in your Bibles, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 as we look at this day that we're celebrating of the resurrection. But I felt compelled by the Lord to answer the question of, can we really believe this all? Because there's extraordinary claims about Jesus being raised from the dead. And I can think back at before I became a Christian in my skeptical mind, and it just didn't make any sense. This isn't something that we see going around us. We have archaeologists that go around and they dig up bodies of people who have died in the past. Their bones are still there. So what's this strange thing about somebody being resurrected from the dead? And really, if this didn't happen in a time in history, then anything that we attach to the resurrection of Christ is meaningless unless this actually happened in time past around 33 AD. And so I wanted to take a look at it and say, well, can we even look to see, can we account for this actually even happening? And then we'll jumpstart that on next week of looking at then the implications of what the resurrection has for our lives. But that, again, is meaningless if it didn't actually happen in time and space within history. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is Paul writing to those who are in Corinth. He writes to them, "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and in which you stand, and by which you are being saved. You hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believe in vain." So Paul starts off with them and saying, I want to remind you of the gospel that I've He's shared the gospel to them in the 14 previous verses. And it's important for us to remember what this gospel message is all about. And the gospel message starts with the idea of where everything began. In the beginning of creation, God dwelt with humanity here on this earth. Adam was walking in the earth that God had created in the garden, and God was right there with them, like the two magnets that are stuck together. But God warned Adam and Eve in that time. He says, but if you choose to disobey me, then there's going to become a separation between you and me. And he says that separation is going to happen because I'm a holy God, and I'm set apart. I'm beyond disobedience. And so if you disobey me, there's going to be a separation between you and I because I don't want to be around disobedience. And I don't know about you guys, but I can kind of relate to God there. I don't like being around people that like to disobey me either. I really don't like to be around people that disagree with my opinion, let alone. So we can't really blame God for saying, you disobey me, there's going to be a separation between you and I. I listen to that as if I'm in a science class and I have my magnets like this, and the teacher tells us, whatever you do, don't flip the magnet. And I get the bright idea going, oh, who is he to tell me what I should do? I now want to flip my magnet. And so then, see if I can do this without pinching my fingers. I flip my magnet. Oh no. Now I got separation between the two. And no matter what I try to do, I'm trying to put them together. I now have a separation. And that's what God was saying in the Garden of Eden. If you disobey me, it's going to cause this separation between you and I. Now the analogy breaks down here because I have a choice to flip the magnet back and get it connected. But it would be likened to the idea of me somebody telling me not to cut my leg off, and I decide to cut my leg off. Well, at the point that I just chose to cut my leg off, I'm stuck with that decision now. I can't go back and go, oh, never mind, I don't really like life with just one leg. No, I'm stuck with having to be with one leg. And that's the same with disobedience. It's like I had one move that I could make, and I chose to flip the magnets, and now I'm stuck with this. But the problem is they're no longer connecting with one another. And that's what disobedience did with humanity, with God. Oops. And so, one of the questions that falls in my mind is, the problem is, though, is God has all these rules, and why do you have to make all these things? He tells us all these things that we're not to do. But if we really, truly stop and we think about it for a second, one of the things that we're told not to do is we're told not to complain. Do you think it really hurts God much if we walk around this earth complaining? No, it really doesn't affect God any. Who does it affect the most? It affects us. When we go around and we are complaining about our job and who our boss is and everything we have to do, or we complain about our wife, or we're complaining about our children, or we're complaining to our friends about who they are or what they've just done, and every activity we get involved in, we're telling them how they could have done it different. Does anybody really want to hang around us? I don't know about you. I don't like hanging around those kind of people that all they do is complain. So really, when God asks us, don't go and complain, do everything without complaining, it's really actually for our benefit. There are some things that God asks us to do that do relate directly to him, but most of them are actually for our benefit. So he's not trying to tell us to do something just because he's got the power to do it, but he's saying this is actually what's going to make life better for you. If I go around and I'm not complaining so much anymore, more people are going to want to hang around me. I'm probably going to have more friends. I'm probably going to be able to find a spouse in the future because I'm somebody that's willing to be lived with that contentment. But then there's other things. Not just what we're refraining from doing, but God also has things that he tells us that we need to be. And he tells us that we need to be content in all things. Again, does our discontentment here on this earth, does that affect God much? No, not really. So why does he tell us to be content? Well, it's for ourselves. When we're walking on this earth and we always think the things that we don't have is what we really need, and it's kind of that idea that we have with that proverb, the grass is always greener on the other side. And all we can think about is that other pasture that looks a whole lot greener. Boy, do we really want that. And we spend our time and our resources trying to get to that other greener fence. And when we finally do jump the fence and jump into it, we love it for about a week. And then it kind of comes normal again. And then we notice that other green field that's over there. And we get thinking about that one. And we put all of our time and energy into that. And what we do is we lose the aspect of being happy with just what we have. Enjoying the family we have, enjoying the things that we have that are to our availability. So God's telling us, be content, not necessarily for himself, but because he's saying that's what's going to bring you the most happiness in the bigger picture in this world. You're meant for relationships. You're meant to walk this earth and be joyous and not always begrudging the things that you do not have. And so this list of commandments and things that we need to be, and there's 613 of them in the Old Testament, and then we can add the things that we're told in the New Testament, but they're not all just rules and regulations just to try to pin us in to have to do something. It's actually God saying, I've created you, I know what's best for you, and these are the things you should abide by to live your life to the fullest of what you were created to be. And so they're not a thing to put us down. But the crazy thing is we rebel against those things. I do choose to complain about things. And the sad part is I find welling up inside myself of when I know I shouldn't complain, there's this part of me going, I'm going to feel a lot better when I do, though. I really should tell my wife this one thing I really dislike about something that I just experienced. And it wells up inside me, and then the next thing I know, I am complaining to her about something that has happened into my life. And it's crazy, because that's the one thing that's destroying what's going to make me happy, is now I've put myself into a bad mood. So God's got to be looking up there at us, just shaking his head going, seriously? This thing that's going to make you better, you're going to rebel against that? And I think of that when we have a friend that we think's going down a wrong road, and we give them counsel, and they refuse to take it, and they do the exact opposite that we say, and we get kind of frustrated with them. Like, I don't get why they're doing that. That's just destroying them. It's got to be the same way God's looking at us every time we break these little do's and don'ts that he has. And these are the things that we call of sin. When we disobey God, when we don't do the things he tells us to do, and we choose to do the things that he tells us to stay away from. That's what we consider sin, and God says not to do those things. And so we do those constantly, and so we are like those magnets. We decide to flip that magnet on God, even though he says, here's what I want you to do, but we find ourselves separated from him because we decided to live life in a way that we chose to do it instead of the way that he's asked us to do it. And that causes some consequences then of having this separation from God. And we look around the world today, and this is what we got. In a way, this analogy breaks down, but to simplify it, it's in a way God pulled his hand back a little bit and said, okay, you want to do it your way? Then I'm going to have to be separated from you. I warned you of that. And so now we have death, pain, and suffering that's come upon this earth. Thorns and thistles have been brought up because of the curse of humanity disobeying God. And we get a little bit example of what the world's like when we get to make the decisions for ourselves. And it's a reminder every time that we walk through this and we have stuff that we have to suffer through, of this was actually our choice. But the weird thing is we have the audacity sometimes to complain to God about it. When we have a loved one taken away from us, we say, God, how dare you take them away from me? You had the power to save them. And God's a lot more loving than I am, because I would think if I was in that boat, I'd be like, no, you're just supposed to do that yourself. This whole time you were saying, no, I want to do all these, even though you say they're going to be better for me, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to follow your standards. But then when it comes to something, me suffering the consequences for it, then I want to lash out at God and say, God, why weren't you there to help me out of this situation? See, I think he allows us to be in this sin-cursed world because it's a reminder of our rebellion. God wants us to know how serious sin is. that there's a consequence for our disobedience. It's the same thing we have as parents with the children. If we don't discipline them, they'll never know the seriousness of what they're doing. I have to tell our kids sometimes of when they don't listen to what we have to say. I say, in this case, it might not seem like that big of a deal that you disobeyed me, but what happens if it's something that your life is dependent on it? What if I tell you, don't move because I see a car speeding in between the two of us, but you choose to do otherwise and you run forward and disobey? That's going to have hellacious consequences. And so I have to train you, even in the times when there's not a consequence, to follow what I'm saying, so that way you're protected even when there is time. Because I said there won't be time to explain everything that's going on. And I think God does that same thing with the sin-cursed world. Saying, I want you to experience what it's like so you really fully understand what their consequences are to disobey me and why I told you to listen to me even in the first place. But the gospel message that God gives us is the remedy for this situation that we found ourselves in. Where God says, okay, now there's a problem. There's that separation between you and I. He says, you no longer can do those things. Like I expressed to you, I'm a Christian and I still struggle about complaining. I can struggle with being content in all things. And God understands that. He says, now that we've broke that relationship, that you don't have my Spirit right there in you, you're going to constantly struggle with this. You can't become right with me anymore. And this is where God is such a loving God, where he says, I'm going to remedy this situation. And I'm going to fulfill all the dues, all the things that I've told you need to do. I'm going to come, I'm going to put on flesh, I'm going to walk this earth, and I'm going to do everything that's the requirement in order to be right with me. He says, but then I'm going to die for the punishment that you deserve. Because he forewarned them, not only was there separation when they disobeyed him, but the end result was death had to happen because of that. And so God says, I'm going to pay that death penalty for you. So even though I've walked this earth, I did everything right, I'm going to die for your sins. And so he does that, and then he rises again to show that that's legitimate, that this is actually true, that God accepts this sacrifice. And he says, okay, now the way that it is, because we couldn't follow what he says, he goes, if you accept that I did that for you, in essence, it's like a human contract. In a human contract, when you're married, both parties have to hold to the contract unless one of them dies. Once one of them dies, then the contract is broken, and the one that is still alive is free to marry whoever else because the other partner has passed away. God says, my contract with you is the same way. As long as both parties are alive, you're held to those standards of you have to do everything that I've told you to do, and keep away from everything I've told you to keep away from. But he says, if you recognize that I died for you, it's as though you died on that cross, that your death penalty has been paid. And so now you are as though dead, but I'm raising you to a new life. And because you're in a new life, I can make a new agreement with you. And this new agreement now is just that you are in my kingdom because you've accepted of what I've done for you. You trust me, in other words, is what he's saying. And it's as simple as that. It's almost like God brought it down a level for us, going, okay, yeah, you couldn't get it at just doing everything that was good for you, so now I'm just going to make it simple and you just got to trust me, and that's all the farther you have to go. But you have to be willing to trust him. He says that's the step that you have to take. If we're not willing to trust him, then it doesn't work. We can't try to use some other God to get to him. We can't try to do it on our own. He said, you have to understand I'm the only one that can do it for you now. To go back to my analogy, I cut off my leg. I can't get it back. So if I want to get my leg back, I'm going to have to count on something else happening here. So God does it so we can have a relationship with him, and he says, this is the way to get back with me now. Now that doesn't automatically get us out of this sin-cursed world, because just because maybe we get it now and we realize how serious our sin was, and we realize what it was like trying to do things on our own, and we live in a world where we're upset all the time, where we're hurting, we have death and pain all around us, and we go, whoa, I see that my choices weren't good, so I'm going to choose God's way this time. There's other people walking in this world that haven't done that yet, and they still have to experience it. If God made everything perfect as soon as we accepted it, then there's going to be the people that were born after us that won't get to see what the world's like when we get to choose things our own way. And so he says, no, you're going to have to walk through this world this way, but in the end, the time is coming when he will either renew all things, or if we proceed in death first, then we will be renewed in heaven with him at that time. That's the gospel message that Paul is saying that he has preached to those around there. And that's the question that arises to us as well. Because we have this new situation. We don't have to do all the do's and don'ts anymore. We just have to trust him. And are we willing to trust him, or are we saying, nope, I'm going to rebel just the same way that I do every time I decide to be upset at something? Now that doesn't mean we don't try to do the things that God has to say to do, because we realize once we trust in him, wait a minute, the things you're telling us to do is actually for our benefit. It's not you're just giving me rules just because you want to give me rules, but you're giving me the best of what I was created to be. And so I'm going to try as hard as I can to not do the things that you forewarned me not to do. And I'm going to try hard to do the things that you tell me to do because you're looking out for me. You're looking for the best for me. But I realize that's not how I get right with him. I'm just doing that because I realize he's looking out for me. He's the creator of this world. I should listen to him. But the way to have access to him is just trusting him that he has provided the way in order for us to get there. And Paul tells them, this is the gospel in which you are standing, you are infirm in. And remember, at any point that we decide to give it up, we've lost it. Nobody can take our faith away. We're promised that no demon can take it away from us, no human being can take it away from us. That it's given to us by grace, meaning that God just bestows it upon us as a gift. But we're told it's through faith. It's through us trusting him. Remember, I said the whole concept is we trust God, that he said, this is the way that you get to me. So that's where we get into problems of we're no longer standing, and if we decide to say, no, I don't believe this is the way that I need to get right with him. I really think I need to follow all these rules again, like he originally said. That's how I'm going to get right with him. And we're not standing and trusting in him. We're saying, God, you're lying to me. This isn't really how you need to do it. And it's kind of crazy, isn't it? It's kind of like a CEO of a company says, here's what I need you to do in order to get this promotion. And he says, actually, no, take that back. I've already did it all for you. And we say, no, the CEO wouldn't know how I need to get that promotion. I'm going to get that promotion all myself. It would be foolish to do that in a human standard. And it's the same thing with God. When God says this is the way to get to me, it's the way to get to him. Verse 3, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. So Paul here reminds them, this was prophesied of things that were to come, and we looked at that last week, that it was prophesied in Isaiah 53 and other verses that he was going to die for humanity and that he was going to be buried for them. And he says that it's according to the Scriptures. And then, a lot of these prophecies were written thousands of years before Jesus even came on the scene. And he says also that he would be raised on the third day. And we'll speak more on Wednesday, our midweek study of what it means with the whole third day and how this all fits together. But he says it is told in the Scriptures that he would raise. Oops, I got my background back there again. So Psalm 16:10 brings this up on saying, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. Thank you, Doug. Sheol is the Hebrew word that signified the grave, being down in the grave, and the corruption is obviously the decay of a person within the grave, and it was prophesied in the Psalms that the Holy One, the one that was to come to save the world, wouldn't have this corruption. And so it was promised that something was going to happen to this individual, that they were not going to rot inside the grave like we see everybody else do. And so this comes up with the question, though, well, this resurrection. This is where Christianity in the mind of the skeptic gets a little bit crazy. Now, wait a minute, you're talking about then this person being raised from the dead and not staying in there. This is not something that we see every single day. And so we come up with these ideas of what maybe had happened inside that tomb. And we say, no, see, it's wrong. He didn't die on the cross. See, what happens is he fainted on there from all the pain he was in. They go and they put him into the tomb, and then he came back awake and he came stumbling out of the tomb, and that's why his body wasn't in the tomb anymore. Sounds like a great illustration until we realize the fact that Jesus was so weakened that he couldn't even carry his own cross. And then he's tortured on the cross, and we looked at that last week, and to such an extent that when he did die, the Romans, who are professionals at executing people, they would know the difference between somebody who's fainted and who is really dead. But to make sure, because their lives depended on it too, they stabbed him up through the side. So blood and water come spewing out. So Jesus at this point has lost such amount of blood. There's no way that he would have fainted and been able to stammer back out of the tomb after that event had happened. Others say, okay, yeah, it wasn't that he fainted, but the problem is, see, the disciples, they went and they stole his body out of the tomb. And this is actually the story that the Jewish people tried to come up with to say why his body was missing. But there's a problem with this. His believers weren't looking for a resurrection. Artie hit this morning when he was talking. The women, when they went and they found the empty tomb, they were going to anoint a dead body with spices. They weren't expecting him to be risen, and so they were panicked when they seen that the tomb was empty. And they were trying to figure out, where is Jesus? They thought the Romans took him for some reason. So then they are flabbergasted Yeah, you know what I meant to say. So Mary runs back and tells two of the male disciples, and they don't believe her. What happened? So they run and go check out the tomb, and they say, well, this is really weird. What's going on? Even when Jesus presents himself to them, he has to remind them, guys, I told you this was going to happen. And again, I already talked about that this morning, of where Jesus was telling them, I'm going to die, but I'm going to raise again in 3 days. And he has to remind them after he resurrected, guys, I told you this was going to happen. But they still didn't get it to such the extent that when those disciples, they're all there except for one, so then they meet the one that wasn't there. They tell him what happened, and guess what? He says, I won't believe it unless I see it myself and I'm able to touch him. They weren't looking for a resurrected Christ, so why would they go steal the body to go fabricate the story? And then some will say, well, no, actually what it is they went to the wrong tomb. See, it was early in the morning with Mary, and so in the darkness she got kind of confused. She went to the wrong tomb. Obviously there's no body in there because it wasn't the right tomb. It wasn't used yet. Well, the problem with this is you forget the fact that John and Peter ran to the tomb later when it was daylight, so you'd have to say that they happened to run to the wrong tomb as well. And Mary was ways behind them, and she ran to the tomb, so she'd have to run to the tomb twice in the wrong manner. So that doesn't really make much sense of how things are going on here. And others say, well, these visions that they had of Jesus coming up, they were just hallucinations. It was almost like a mirage that they were seeing. The problem is, what we're going to read in the text here in a little bit, Paul's going to say that Jesus appeared to over 500 at one time. So you'd have to say that over 500 people had the exact same hallucination at the exact same time, and Jesus appeared over 40 days, period. So people were having hallucinations for like over 40 days, and then all of a sudden everything stopped. It just doesn't make much sense. Some will take the hallucination one and change it a little bit and say, no, really what it was, the disciples were sitting around one day, and they finally realized, oh, Jesus isn't dead. He's still alive in our hearts. And that's what they were trying to explain to us. Well, with that one or any of these other ones that we've mentioned or anything else somebody can conjure up, there's still a big major issue. You have an empty tomb. If Jesus' body was really in the grave, the way they could have stopped Christianity from the very beginning was the body. Say, right here Jesus is. See, they went to the wrong tomb. He's right here. Or Jesus isn't alive in your heart. He's dead. Here's his body right here. So they have to account for that. We have an empty tomb that can't be accounted for. And the other one is essentially the visions that they had, or not visions, sorry, I'm using bad language now, the physical representation of Jesus coming in their presence in his resurrected form of over these 500 individuals over 40 days that have to be accounted for. Why were people making these types of claims if that's not really what happened? Let's go on to our verse in verse 5. And he appeared to Cephas and then the 12. He appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then also to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Here Paul goes through and he gives the eyewitness testimony of those that would see the resurrection. And this is the biggest proof of why we can believe that God rose from the dead. Paul says to such an extent, there was over 500 that seen him, and he didn't say just, trust me on this. He says, there's some of them that are still alive. In Paul's day, when he was writing this, in essence, he was saying, go talk to them. They can affirm the account that what I'm telling you. If you're making something up, you don't tell people to go check out all the witnesses you have that have seen this information. But that's what's true. He recognizes that some have fallen asleep, and that's very interesting language of their expectation of the resurrection to come, of realizing it wasn't a final death. This wasn't the end, but they were going to wake back up again sometime, and we'll look more at that next week. But he gives these eyewitnesses accounts. And what we see with the eyewitnesses is we want to make sure, though, that they're reliable to be able to understand. And so how do we know if an eyewitness is somebody we should listen to? Well, they need to have firsthand knowledge. And we see that with these people. They're not saying that my brother Joe's great-great-uncle had passed down this information to us a long time ago. He says, no, we have seen the resurrected Lord. This is Paul writing this. He says, I have seen it. And he talks about the 500 and some of them that are still alive. Peter and them have seen it. This is firsthand knowledge that they've seen. This isn't just secondhand information being passed down. And then you want to make sure that there's a sufficient number. Is this just a couple of crazy people walking around saying these kind of things? Or is it something that we can believe because there's a large majority? And that's what we see with this. We have Jesus appear to Mary, and then he appeared to the other women that were at the tomb. Then he appears to two disciples on their way to Emmaus. And then he appears to Peter. and then he appears to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and then he appears to them in Galilee, and then he appears to the 500 at one time, and then he appears to James, and then he appears to those that are at his ascension, and he appears to Paul later on too. So we have way over 500 individuals that have seen the appearance of Christ in his resurrection. So we have a sufficient number of eyewitness testimonies of this event happening. And the last thing we're going to look at is going, but are they reliable? Is this somebody that we can trust the information that they have to say, or are they gaining something from this? And so the eyewitnesses' reliability, we look at, are they independent of each other? And we see that. This is over a time span of 40 days. He appeared to Mary different time than when he did to James, different from when he did to Paul, different than when he did to the 500 at once. And he's seen the disciples into a group. And so these are independent from one another, but yet their stories collaborate of what they've seen, what Jesus' body was really like. And then we had the disinclination to believe at first, and we've already looked at this. They weren't looking for a resurrected Christ. So it doesn't make sense that they were making this up to forward the momentum of something that they had proclaimed beforehand, because they were just as lost as what we were when this all transpired. And the character of their witness is strong, because we see later on as they're promoting the gospel message, there's some that come before them that lie to them. And they rebuke them that lying is not a good thing to do. And then later on, they're performing works. They lay hands on people. They receive the Holy Spirit. And somebody comes up to them and says, what do I pay you in order to have that power to give people the Holy Spirit? And they rebuke him and say, no, this isn't about making money. You can't buy this with money, this power. And so they rebuke. So we see this isn't a pride and prestige thing that they're looking for. And the last is we see that they're steadfast in persecution. People will die for a lie. We see that with those that do suicide bombings. We see that with the people that fall for the false messiahs that drink the juice altogether and they end up dying. They'll die for a lie. But people don't die for a known lie. The people that make this stuff up don't get tortured to death to hold to a lie. Because the only reason that you lie is because you're gaining something. At the point that the consequences of your lie outweigh the benefits, you decide it's no longer a good idea to lie. And that would have been the same with the disciples. They would have been, we know at least 10 of them was tortured for their faith. They didn't just die for their faith. They were tortured for it. And now if you made up a lie about this information, are you really going to be willing to go through torture just to carry on your lie? Or are you going to realize that if all you have to say is go, nope, I made this up, and you don't get to be tortured anymore, you're probably going to recant from what you had to say. But these guys were willing to be tortured for what they were holding on to because this message was true and authentic. And it's not just one person. It wasn't just like, oh, this person maybe wasn't mentally fully with it, so they didn't comprehend things going on. No, you have a vast multitude of these men. At least 10 of the disciples that had strong or horrific deaths that they would have had to went through. But we're looking at even the bigger picture. The 500 witnesses that we read about there, they lost everything in believing in this. This was a culture where your religion was a strong part of who you are. So they lost family ties. They weren't allowed to be a part of the family. They lost connection to the synagogue that they were in, and they're religious. They were basically excommunicated from their community and what they're doing, their jobs. They probably lost a lot of their jobs. It wasn't something that we're doing this in order to gain more money or to gain a lot of fame. They lost all of that by holding on to this. So the only reason somebody's willing to do that is actually if they're holding on to the truth. And that's what we see with these guys going on here. But it's not just the Bible that we're able to read these things in. We see even in extra-biblical, historical resources that account for the same kind of information. Now, the one thing you're not going to find in a non-Christian resource is that Jesus rose from the grave to save humanity. Because at the point that you believe that, you become a Christian, and so now all your writing is considered Christian. So I want you to understand, I cannot show you that there's non-Christians out there that wrote that Jesus rose from the dead to save humanity, because that is a Christian claim, so you're automatically a Christian document when you say that. But Tacitus is just a Roman historian. He's not a Christian by any means, writes of this work even in his things, and he talks about how Christ had been executed in Tiberius' reign under Pilate. But he goes on to say even more. He says, but in spite of this temporary setback, the deadly superstition had broke out afresh. You can't get much closer than that for him saying that something happened when Christ died that kept this forward momentum going in even a greater extent than when this individual was even alive. Now, he doesn't specifically mention the resurrection, but he's talking about the effects of what happens there. So we can see that even somebody who's not a Christian is writing about these things that we're talking about here in the Bible. And Josephus, who again is a Roman historian but not a a Christian by any means. He actually does point out the resurrection, that there's some that claim that Jesus had rose from the dead during that time. And so we see it even in extra historical writings outside of the Bible that this event had occurred. So what do we have to take from this then? If we decide that we're going to reject the eyewitness testimony in the Bible, then we're going to have to reject almost every other eyewitness testimony of other ancient accounts. And I put the word most in there just to try to protect myself. But I would almost say that we'd have to reject all eyewitnesses' testimony. Because I don't know of any other historical document that has over 500 eyewitnesses this close to what had happened, has other historical documents that correspond to the same events transpiring. So if we're going to say, no, the resurrection couldn't happen, then we're going to have to question everything else that has happened in history, because we're saying that that eyewitness testimony isn't valid. So that's the biggest thing of why we can believe what we have to say, is that we had people that seen it, saw it. There's no motive for them to be able to lie to us about the things that have happened. And because of that, we have great hope and assurance of what Christ has done. And that's what we'll look at next week as we answer the question, Jesus rose, so what? What's in it for me? What's the whole point? We celebrate this once a year, this fact that this individual comes out of the tomb. I don't get what's the significance of all this, and we'll look at that next week. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that you didn't leave us here on this earth to try to work out our own situation of our separation that we have from you, that you put on humanity, that you came here to this earth, you fulfilled everything that was required of us, and you provided a way for us to come to you in a brand new way that's just as simple as just trusting that you have done it for us. To trust you that we have a broken relationship with you, but to trust you that you have made it so we can have a relationship with you again. We just have to trust that you are the one that did it. It's not by anything that we can do on our own, but it's relying on you. And Lord, may we not push aside the things that you say are good things to have into this life, because that is what you say is best for us. It's best for humanity as a whole. It's best for us individually. And it's showing that we understand that you are supreme and you are our authority into our lives. And so we do want to do the things that you ask us to do. And that's why we gather together to read your word, to become the people that you've asked us to become. And we thank you for that, Lord. You haven't left us alone. You've given us your word. You've given us your Holy Spirit. As soon as we trust you, that you are the way to have access to you, Lord, you put your Spirit within us to make things clear and understandable. And we thank you for that. In Jesus' name we pray.